Listen carefully, because what you are about to hear was scratched into the margin of a herbalist's diary in 1897. Burnt-out monastery where she had been hiding. It had been sleeping for 100 years. It opened its eyes. It smelled her warm blood drifting through the fog. And it followed that scent, directly to the corner where she lay sleeping under a pile of rags. You would think this is the moment she died. It is not. It is the moment she was saved, by the very thing the world had spent centuries trying to burn. Now, to understand why this monster did not feed that night, you have to go back. Not 7 nights. Not 8. You have to go back 133 years, to a monastery on a hill above a Romanian village called Plescu. A monastery the villagers loved and feared in almost equal measure. The abbot's name was Stefan Voskar. He was at that time a man, or something that had once been a man, 400 years old already, and tired in the way only the very old can be tired. He had founded the order himself in 1492, and he had built it on one strict rule he wrote in his own ink. We shall feed only on the shall guard the village from what walks the dark. He had kept that rule for 2 centuries. The whole order had. 12 brothers, all of them turned by him, all of them sworn. And the villagers below, they knew, in the half-knowing way villagers always know, that the monks on the hill were not quite ordinary monks, but the orphans. The monks paid for their wells and their grain in the bad years. And so the villagers looked the other way. They called Stefan father, and they meant it. Then came 1689. A wandering preacher from the south, with a wooden cross the size of his forearm and a voice like cracking ice, walked into the village preaching. He preached that the hill was cursed. He preached that the monks were drinkers of blood. He preached that the wells had gone bad because the abbot was a demon. And the villagers, frightened, hungry, easy to push, they listened for 3 weeks. Monastery to its stones. 11 of the brothers died in the fire. Stephen the 12th, the abbot, he retreated. It's the way the old vampires must, to walk in the dark and remember that they are still alive. He fed on deer. He fed on rabbits. He never fed on a single human being. And every century when he woke, the ruins above him were a little more swallowed by the forest. By the year 1822, no one remembered the monastery at all. Not a single living soul, except the old vampire sleeping beneath it. Now meet the child. Her name was Myra, 14 years old in 1822, and she had not spoken a word since she was 5. The village midwife had said Myra had been born under a partial reason for her silence. Her mother believed it. She told the other women, in whispers behind cupped hands, that the girl had been touched. Not cursed exactly, just touched. But after the mother died of fever when Myra was 9, that name was the cursed one. Children threw small stones at her ankles. Old women crossed themselves when she passed. The priest refused to bless her at Easter. Only her uncle gave from the south, and it killed 81 people in Myra's village in 17 days. Her uncle's wife, his 3 sons, everyone. And on the 18th day, with the smell of burning bodies still in the air, her uncle pointed one shaking finger at Myra and said the word he had been holding in for years. He said which girl had brought it. He threw her out at dusk, with no coat, a half-loaf of black bread, and the clothes she stood up in. Myra walked. She walked north because north was uphill, and uphill led away from the smoke. She walked for 19 days. She slept under fallen logs. She ate berries. With hunger and cold, she stumbled into a clearing and saw, rising out of the fog like the broken teeth of a giant, the ruins of a monastery. The chapel was half collapsed. As old bone, and Myra crawled into it and folded herself into the smallest possible shape and fell asleep. That was night 1. She stayed for 7 nights. She did not know why, only that something in the cold, dead silence of the ruins felt safer than every village she had ever known. She drank rainwater from a cracked stone basin near the altar, ate the last of her uncle's bread on the 2nd night, and after that she ate the small black berries from the thorn bush that had grown up through the south wall. She grew weaker. By the 7th night, she could barely lift her head. The fog came in thick that evening, a low, blood-tinted fog the color of bruised wine, because the moon overhead was full and copper-red. Myra curled in her corner, and her small breath made a soft white plume in the candle less dark, and beneath her, 20 meters down, under stones older than any kingdom on the continent, an old, old set of eyes opened in the dark. He sat up slowly. Stefan Voskar, 530 years old in that exact moment, sat up in his stone cradle and listened. The first thing directly above him, in the chapel itself, beating in the soft, thin rhythm of a child who is starving and asleep. Stefan stood up. He climbed the spiral stair. Smell. Warm blood. Berry juice in the small, empty stomach. Slightly parted. One small white hand curled under her chin. Sleeping. Breathing in soft fog. Helpless as a moth. And he stood, finds a 14-year-old orphan asleep alone in his own ruined house. The story writes itself. Except it does not. Because Stefan Voskar had spent 2 centuries before the burning, and 1 century after it, training himself out of one specific hunger. He had taught his brother carved into a soul the way a river carves a canyon, slowly, slowly, until the stone itself becomes the shape of the water. And so when Stefan looked down at the child, what he felt was not hunger. It was the feeling he had felt the first up and gone to live in the village, and her great-great-great-grandchildren had been among the people who came up the hill with torches in 1689. He did not blame them. Crowds are a kind of weather over the sleeping girl. He tucked the corner of it under her chin so that her breath would warm the cloth and the cloth would warm her face. And then he sat down on the chapel floor beside the fallen pew, and he did not move again until the eastern sky began to gray. When the first hint of dawn touched the broken wait for the second night. He did not feed on her. He did not even touch her skin. On the ninth night, Stefan rose again. But this time, he did not come up empty-handed. He had spent the daylight hour thinking about what a starving child needs after weeks of berries. There were 2 old earthen jars in the crypt's far alcove, sealed when the monastery still lived, full of honey from the order's bees. Honey does not spoil. He took one. He took a small brass cup. Then he went up into the night. He spent 2 hours in the forest. Stefan moved through forest the way smoke moves through trees, and he gathered wild apples, late and small and sour but still good. Hazel had missed. A handful of late summer raspberries from a bramble he remembered from his own boyhood. He laid it all out on a clean flat stone beside her corner. And he waited. She woke just before midnight. She woke the way starving children wake, slowly, the body refusing to trust the world. First the eyes opened. Then the smell of honey reached her, and her whole face changed. Knows that food has a price. She turned her head slowly, looking for the price. And she saw him. And here is the moment. She did not scream. She did not run. She had been called cursed for 9 years by people who all had pulses, and now a man stood in the dark who was not breathing, and she looked at him and she understood that he was not going to hurt her. She nodded at him. She ate. She ate carefully, small bites, long pauses, and he watched without moving. When she had eaten half of what he laid out, she stopped. Her stomach was tiny from finally she slept. He watched until dawn and then went down. On the 10th night he brought her more. On the 11th he brought her a small bone needle and a strip of cured leather, and he showed her, by gesture only, how to patch the hole in the side of her boot. She watched his hands. On the 12th night she ate apples and listened while he sat across the chapel from her, and for the first time in 133 years, hummed a funeral hymn in a key so old most living musicians would not have recognized it. Myra listened with her whole small body, and when he stopped, she put one hand flat against. Thank you. was running out of time. The wake cycle of an old vampire is brutal in its arithmetic. 7 nights, then back to the crypt before the 8th dawn, or the sun finds you and the long sleep becomes the longer one. He had 2 nights left, and he realized, sitting in the chapel while she gave a name too, but out of a colder, simpler arithmetic. The winter was coming. The ruins were not warm. If he went down into his crypt and did not come back up for 100 years, the child would not survive 40 days. And so he decided. He would not return to the crypt. He would sleep in the chapel. There was walls and no windows, sealed tight enough to keep the sun out, and he would sleep there beside the orphan through the coming winter. It was a decision that would, if it went wrong, kill him. He made it anyway. He told her by gesture on the 6th. Fully. But she nodded. And it was on the 7th night, the night before everything changed, that the hunter saw the smoke. Because of course she had built a small fire. He had brought her dry wood and shown her how, on the 3rd night, so she would not freeze. The fire was small and sheltered. The hunter from the village of Borsty, 9 miles south, was walking the high ridge looking for a wounded stag, and he saw the thin gray column lifting out of what everyone in Borsty knew was the cursed hill. By dawn, half of Borsty had heard the rumor, and by mid-morning the priest had given it a shape. The cursed child from Plescu, he said, for her story had drifted south with the typhus refugees, had run to the cursed hill, and the dark things had answered her, and unless something was done by sundown, the typhus that had killed 81 a mob was forming. By 3 in the afternoon, 28 men were walking up the hill with pitch torches, oil, hatchets, and the same wooden cross the wandering preacher's grandson had carried down from the loft of the church. They reached the edge of the clearing, just as the sun touched the western trees. They saw the half-collapsed walls. They saw the chapel. They saw the thin smoke. And the leader, Andrei Kajin, 36 years old, with a face like a tired cliff, raised his hand for silence and started walking forward. And Stefan Voskar, in the dim, safe blue of the moment before sunset, came out of the chapel doorway and stood between the mob and the child. He was already weakening. The sun had not quite. The last red rays of it through the trees pressed on him like hot iron through cloth. His skin in that half-light was the color of old bone. He held nothing in his hands. He stood barefoot on the chapel step, in his black wool tunic, with the abbot's silver chain hanging at his throat. The mob stopped. Andrei Kajin took one half-step back and raised his hatchet. Stefan opened his mouth. And for the first time in 133 years, he spoke. His voice was the voice of a man who has been silent a very long time and has chosen, with great care, the next words he will say. It was the abbot of this house. He said, I founded the order of Saint Ileana of the Mercies in the year of our Lord 1492, and we did feed the poor of Plescu in 7 famines, and we did take in 11 foundlings between 1503 and 1689, and we did never lift our hand against a single soul. Night of the harvest moon, by the torches of men who had forgotten what we were. He said, and I have been waiting since that night for someone to remember. And then he began to recite the founding prayer of the order. In Latin, the same Latin he had himself written in 1492. The mob stood frozen. The hatchet stayed in the air. Because Andrei Kajan's grandfather had been one of the foundlings. He had been the 8th of the 11, taken in by the order in 1685, 4 years before the burning, as a baby left in the snow at the chapel gate. The order had given him to a childless family in Borsty when he was 3. He had grown up married, fathered a son who fathered Andrei, and on the night he died at the age of 81, he had asked for one prayer to be said over his body in Latin. That same prayer. Andrei had been 5 years old at the funeral. He had not understood a word. Andrei Kajan lowered his hatchet. He turned to the mob. He said one word. Stop. It is hard to stop a mob in motion. Sometimes, very, very rarely, it takes one word from the Andrei Kajan was the right man. The mob stopped. They lowered their torches. Half of them looked at the ground. One of them, an older man near the back, started to cry without seeming to know it. Andrei walked forward across the clearing alone. The last red ray of the dying sun, and he said, I am sorry, Father. He used the word the village had used for the abbot before the burning. He had not chosen it consciously. It had risen out of him. Stefan inclined his head. From behind his knee, where she had been holding to his tunic without making a sound, Myra stepped out into the clearing. She looked at Andrei. Andrei looked at her. He saw a 14-year-old girl, very thin, wearing a wool cloak too big for her. Cursed. The word felt absurd in his mouth now, even unspoken. He went down on one knee. Every motion costing him, and he reached one long, pale hand into the fold of his tunic, and he drew out a small object that had been resting against his cold chest for the last 7 nights. A silver cross. Small, plain, no jewels. The cross of the Order of Saint Ileana of the Mercies, worn by the abbot himself across all his centuries, and lost to the world since 1689. He bent down and pressed it into Myra's palm, and closed her small fingers around it. He spoke once more, and this time only to her. He said, You are under the protection of the monastery of Saint Ileana, child, and the monastery is in your hand now, and so long as you carry it, you are not cursed, and prayer will say otherwise. She looked up at him with the silver cross hot in her hand, and she nodded once. The same small, slow nod she had given him on the 9th night across a chapel floor full of honey. Then she turned to Andrei Kajan. Andrei stood up. He said, Come home with me, child. 10 years. And Myra put her small free hand into the calloused hand of the hunter who had come to burn her, and she did not look back. She did look back. Once. At the chapel door. Stefan Vaskar was already gone. The trap door had closed behind him. He went down into his crypt with the founding prayer still warm on his tongue, and the smell of the child still in the wool of his tunic. He lay down in the stone cradle. He folded his hands across. They were watched quiet. Because Andrei Kajan, when he got home that night with the child holding his hand, told his wife the whole story, and his wife, Alina, 29 years priest, after a long week of prayer, agreed to bless the ruins quietly, with no public ceremony, the way the old monastery had wanted to be remembered. They told their son when he was old enough, and he told his daughter. The story of the herbalist. They called her the Silent Saint. They called her the one who came out of the cursed hill and saved 19 children in the winter of 1841 with a tea made of bark and honey. And they had stopped, very quietly and very completely, calling her cursed. She married late. She had one son. He had four, had a daughter of her own, Myra's great-granddaughter, named Elena, after the hunter's wife who had taken Myra in, and she was, in 1922, the village's herbalist herself. Myra lived to be 89 years old. She never spoke a word out loud. The muteness was real. It was simply not as her village had once been. And the second of them, bound in soft brown leather, hidden under a floorboard in her son's house for 40 years after her death, contained, in her small, careful script, the only first she wrote that she had been called cursed by every mouth she had ever heard speak, and that he had pressed silver into her hand and said she was not. She wrote that she had been afraid of him for exactly 43 minutes, on the second night, when his humming had startled her awake, and after those 43 the 9 miles up the hill alone, in good weather and bad, and she had left an offering on the chapel floor in the corner where she had hidden. Bread, berries, a small bowl of honey, a few wild apples in autumn. She wrote that she did not know if he ever woke to eat them. She suspected he did not, that the offerings were for her, the way prayers are, but that she left them anyway, because some debts are paid in installments across decades, and some debts cannot be paid at all and must simply be acknowledged at the door. She wrote that her great-granddaughter, the second Elena, was already walking up the hill alone on full moons by the age of 12, with bread in a clean cloth and a small jar of honey in her apron pocket, and the village by then had stopped asking why. They called it the protected hill now. A stone marker was set at the edge of the clearing in 1889 with a single Latin word carved into it, requies, rest, and on the night of the full moon in October of 19 again 20 meters down in the dark. He listened. He heard wind in the trees. He heard the slow drip of water. He heard again a small, slow human heartbeat. No fear. He walked the 7 slow strides across the chapel. He stood over the corner where Myra had slept. There was a small flat stone there now, set into the floor as an altar, and on the stone there was a clean cloth, and on the cloth there was a loaf of dark bread, a wooden bowl of late summer berries, a small jar of honey, and a young woman, wearing a wool cloak too big for her, kneeling beside the altar and pressing dried wildflowers between 2 boards. She looked up. She did not scream. She had been told the story by her grandmother, who had been Stefan looked at her for a long minute. Then he bowed his head, the way he had bowed it the night Myra pressed her own hand over her own heart, and he turned, and he walked back to the trapdoor, and he went down. The pact, you see, was not between Stefan and Myra. It had never been between just the two of them. It was between the old monastery and the village, and the monastery was in Myra's hand, and the great-granddaughter would, in time, have a daughter, who would have a daughter, who would walk up the hill on full moons with bread and berries and honey, and the founding prayer of the dried wildflowers sat in their altar, and Stefan Voskar slept on, and the world above forgot mostly, and remembered just enough, and the hill stayed clean. She hid for 7 nights from a world that called her cursed. He woke after 100 years for one single purpose. Some saints sleep where no one looks.